It's Platt, and today we tried the star of African lagers. That's next to Platt's Beer of the Week. So the particular beer today is literally Star Lager. On the bottom they say Shine Bobo. Not sure what that means. This beer comes to us from Nigeria, not necessarily a hotbed of craft beer, but the seventh largest, most populated country in the world, so definitely a big market, if anything. Background on this beer: the brewery itself was established in Nigeria in 1946 by a gentleman named Frank Samuels. Frank was the chairman of a company known as UAC, United Africa Companies. Basically, this is one of these trading companies that were created back in the days of colonialization, kind of your all-purpose catch-all businesses. Frank had decided that after World War II, it was time to create breweries in Africa. And in 1946, UAC and Heineken partnered together to create the Nigerian Brewing Limited. They formed the company, started building brewery, and in June 1949, they were able to release their first product, Star Lager, onto the market. Now, the original marketing of this beer was kind of interesting. They sold it as their hometown beer, homegrown beer for the locals, but they also put the tagline that it met international standards. I think we can read where they were going with that, but that was how it was marketed. It originally was served at things like state dinners and the kind of the aristocrats that there were in Nigeria at the time. It kind of started with them, and obviously the foreigners that were in there for business. It was kind of created for them. Quickly gained traction though, and in 1954 this beer actually won Best Bottled Beer at the British Empire and Commonwealth Beer Competition. A lot of words there. But like I said, they started gaining some traction. In 1957 they opened their second brewery in a city called Aba, not the 70s group, but Aba. And they created a second brewery. Over the years, by the 60s, they quickly became the number one beer in the Nigerian market, and really over the years started to grow, gain not just market dominance, but started to work out in the rest of Africa. And by 1986, they ended up rolling an arm of the company off to become their export arm. They started exporting to the UK, US, Canada, what have you. Today, there's a total of 9 breweries under the corporate structure. They have 2 malting plants, which is kind of cool, keeping that in-house. And just with the world of, logistics, supply chains, 2 malting houses probably do come in handy. They also do some contract brewing. They produce Heineken for that market. They also produce Tiger, which is a beer based out of Singapore. They produce a full line of soft drinks. They make their own bitters. They even have a line of malted beverages. So when I talk about malted beverages, these are non-alcoholic beverages. They do have hops. It's basically beer that hasn't been fermented, but since it hadn't been fermented, it has all that malt sweetness. It's generally consumed like a soft drink. Here in the U.S., the only brand I kind of see around is something called Malta Goya. I think it's G-O-Y-A, Malta G-O-Y-A. Anyway, that's the only brand I see here in the U.S., but overseas it's more of a thing, or it's more of a soft drink option. They produce, Amstel has a version called Amstel Malta, and they produce that as well as some of their own lines, which I found quite interesting. Real quick, let's talk about some of the other beers. They do have a decent little line of beers. First is 33 Export. I don't know if it's because they're Larry Bird fans or not, but 5% ABV, golden lager. I did notice when reading that it was made with sorghum. Now, I think a few months back I talked about a sorghum beer, and at the time I was talking about Guinness, I believe in Nigeria, also use sorghum. So you do see sorghum utilized in some beers in Africa and I think Southeast Asia too. Next is Goldberg, probably for the wrestling fans over there. 5% ABV. This is another classic kind of golden lager. Interesting enough, in the marketing on the website for this beer, one of the first things they talk about is no added sugar. Like, kind of implying that there's other beers in their lines that are, but I found that very interesting. Also, the marketing for it, it to me seems like it reminds me of the marketing of Michelob in the late '70s and early '80s. The Michelob was an American lager, just like Bud Miller and Coors, but it was considered a little nicer. This is not something you were drinking at the bar; you were drinking at the steakhouse, that kind of thing. And so that Goldberg beer has similar marketing. Next, we have Legend Extra Stout, 6.5% ABV. Interesting enough, they have several stouts in their line. And you wouldn't think with that climate and also culturally, you wouldn't think stouts are that big, but apparently there is a decent sized market for stouts in Nigeria. Caramel coloring is added on this particular beer. Lastly, a great name for a beer, but an even better advertising tagline. It is Turbo King, 6.5% ABV. This is a stout, and their commercial tagline, whoever wrote this, give them a raise. For every day's hard work, claim your throne. Seriously, you gotta love that. Well, before I try this particular beer, though, let's check out the stats. So, before we try this beer, looking through my records, I think this is the first African beer I have tried on the channel. And so today I thought I'd talk about some of the brands that are out there for African beers. I don't think a craft revolution has quite hit them yet, but Africa is growing rapidly, their economies are booming, and so there is a movement in the brewing scene, and then there's growing numbers of breweries, whatever. So I thought I'd talk about some of those brands today. First is Castle from South Africa, kind of your classic European pale lager, which if you think about their history, kind of makes sense. It is the most consumed beer in South Africa. Next, we have Windhoek, 4% ABV, another kind of classic European pale lager, which again, if you think about the history of Africa, in the colonization, that's going to be a lot of their beer history. This particular beer is produced in Namibia, which, if I remember right, was a Dutch colony at one time. So again, beers like Heineken or whatever probably did have an influence on their beer scene. Next is Tango, 4.8% ABV. And the marketing for this, all I found was the blonde. Don't know if it's a blonde ale, blonde lager, but just blonde. Comes to us from Algeria, which is kind of unique considering it is a Muslim country. And from what I gather, for most of the country, there is no alcohol consumed and people don't consume alcohol. But they supposedly have like special corridors and areas for tourists and what have you. I'm sure if you work at the U.S. Embassy there or wherever, you have access to it. So that's what that beer is for. Lastly, from Botswana, we have St. Louis Lager. Now, I'm not talking about Budweiser. I'm talking about a beer called St. Louis Lager that is produced in Botswana. 3.5% ABV. This is a lower ABV beer produced to just be easy drinking, kind of fun beer. It is interesting in reading some of these beers. Here in the U.S., we kind of think the South is where you have to dodge some crazy rules and this, that, and the other. Well, Africa has a little bit of that its own, again, partially because of the different religious groups or what have you. But I found that quite interesting. Well, enough about that. Let's drink an African beer. All right, now this pours a little bit darker than your classic, because we see it's a green bottle. Remember Heineken, is a partner in it. It comes off a little darker. I noticed that right up front. Fairly clear. Let's go into the nose. That is a pretty simple nose, a little malt sweetness. Not sure what else I'm getting on there. Let's give it a try. That does hit a little different. It does have a little body to it. You get some of that malt mouth feel, but not a ton. Hops aren't really noticeable, but it's balanced, not a sweet beer. Anyway, no green bottle funk. That is one thing I noticed for sure. This is not a bad lager, but also nothing really kind of sticks out. It goes down easy, but it's not light. Short finish. Yeah, not a lot to this beer. This is probably one of those things that if I had to do business in Nigeria for some reason, and I'm like, hey, give me a local brew. This is probably what the guy at the hotel is going to hand me, and you know what, would definitely get me through the trip. The carbonation, there's plenty of bubbles, but I don't get on the mouth an effervescence. It just kind of lays on the palate. Well, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe down below. Also, please like the video because it lets YouTube know we're putting out good content. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or beers that you'd like me to try, please leave them in the comment section, or you can always contact me on the Twitter page. Until next time, bottoms up.